Have you ever stopped to think about the energy driving almost everything? I mean, a warm fire, your phone charging, even just your body using energy right now.
Mhm.
They seem different, but they're all connected, aren't they? Governed by some really fundamental chemical principles.
Absolutely. And that connection is exactly what we're diving into today, thermochemistry. It's
Oh,
basically the study of energy changes, especially heat, during chemical reactions. It really took off, during the Industrial Revolution. People were fascinated by heat, steam engines, power.
right. Trying to understand what makes things go.
Exactly, that fundamental curiosity.
So, our mission today is to pull out the core ideas from chemistry, the central science. We want to make thermochemistry clear, link it to things you see every day, and hopefully give you a few aha moments quickly but thoroughly.
Sounds good. Let's get started.
Okay, so
Yeah.
energy. The textbook definition is the capacity to do work or transfer heat. Let's unpack that a bit.
Right. So energy comes in two main flavors: kinetic, which is energy of motion, and potential, which is stored energy. Think position or chemical composition.
And in chemistry, we're often focused on potential energy, right?
Yeah.
Particularly how it changes.
Exactly. It mostly comes down to electrostatic interactions, attractions and repulsions between charged particles at the atomic level.
The pluses and minuses. So, like charges repel, opposites attract. And that electrostatic potential energy, it depends on the charges and how far apart they are.
Precisely. EEL KQ1Q2 tet. Higher charges means stronger interaction. Closer distance means stronger interaction.
So if you have opposite charges, like Na plus and Cl, they want to come together. Their potential energy is negative, and it gets more negative, lower, as they get closer.
Right, and that lowering of energy means energy is released when the bond forms. Nature favors lower energy states,
And the opposite is true for breaking bonds. You have to pull those attracted particles apart.
which requires energy input. You have to increase their potential energy to separate them. That holds for ionic bonds, covalent bonds, you name it. Forming bonds releases energy. Breaking them requires energy.
Okay, I see that. And we experience this constantly. A propane grill burning. That's bond breaking and forming, releasing heat, right?
Yep, exothermic, releasing energy.
Or reactions doing work, like gasoline combustion, pushing pistons in a car.
That's chemical energy converting to mechanical work, or even simpler, the CO2 pushing a champagne cork out. That's work being done by expanding gas.
How's these energy conversions happening? Which, I guess, brings us to the big one. The first law of thermodynamics
Ah, yes, the cornerstone. Energy is conserved.
can't be created or destroyed.
Never. It just changes form. Chemical to thermal, light to chemical in photosynthesis, food energy to motion in our bodies. It's all just shuffling around.
Okay, so to track the shuffling, we need some terms. System and surroundings.
Critical distinction. The system is what we're focused on, the chemicals reacting, maybe. The surroundings is just everything else.
Yeah.
The beaker, the air, the universe.
Right, and systems can be open, closed, or isolated.
Exactly. Open systems exchange matter and energy, like a boiling pot without a lid. Closed systems exchange energy, but not matter. Think a sealed test tube reaction. Isolated systems, well, they're supposed to exchange neither, like a perfect thermos, but that's more of an ideal.
Got it. So within the system, there's its internal energy, E, all the kinetic and potential energy combined.
That's the one. But honestly, we almost never know the absolute E. What we can measure and what's usually more useful is the change in internal energy, BE final minus initial.
A final initial, and the sign matters. Positive E means,
System gained energy, like a deposit into your energy bank account.
and negative B.
System lost energy, a withdrawal.
Okay, and that change, E, comes from heat, Q, and work, W, the famous equation. E, Q plus W.
That's it. And the sign conventions here are crucial. Positive Q means heat absorbed by the system. Negative Q means heat lost by the system.
And work, W.
Positive W is work done on the system by the surroundings. Negative W is work done by the system on the surroundings, like expanding gas pushing a piston.
Okay, heat absorbed, heat lost. This sounds like endothermic and exothermic.
Precisely. Endothermic processes absorb heat. Q is positive. The system gains heat, so the surroundings often feel cold. Think of ice melting in your hand.
Right, it pulls heat from your hand.
Exactly. Exothermic processes release heat. Q is negative. The system loses heat, making the surroundings hotter, like that thermite reaction or just burning wood.
Makes sense.
Mhm.
Now, you mentioned something earlier. Internal energy, E, is a state function. What does that actually mean for us?
Yes, a state function is a property that depends only on the current state of the system, not how it got there.
Like the mountain climbing analogy. Your altitude change is the same regardless of the path you took.
Perfect analogy. Altitude is a state function. AA is like that. Its value only depends on the initial and final states, but the path does matter for heat, Q, and work, W.
So Q and W are not state functions.
Correct. They depend on the specific process. You could discharge a battery by shorting it out, mostly heat released, little work, or use it to run a motor, less heat, more work. The total A is the same in both cases, but the amounts of Q and W are different because the path was different.
That's a really key distinction. Okay, so how do we actually measure these energy changes? Calorimetry.
Yep, that's the technique, measuring heat flow. And central to that is specific heat capacity, or just specific heat. It's the energy need to raise 1 gram of a substance by 1 Kelvin, or 1 degree Celsius.
And water's specific heat is famously high, right? 4.18 JGK.
Unusually high. Which is why oceans moderate climate so well, and why our bodies, being mostly water, can maintain a stable temperature. That value, 4.18 joules, also defines the calorie, by the way.
Oh, okay. And there are different types of calorimeters. Coffee cup.
The coffee cup calorimeter is simple, basically an insulated cup. It operates at constant pressure, usually atmospheric pressure. So the heat change you measure in it, Q, is actually equal to the enthalpy change, EH, which we'll get to. Good for reactions in solution.
And the other one, the bomb calorimeter. Sounds intense.
It is. It's a strong, sealed steel vessel, the bomb submerged in water. Used for combustion reactions, things that release a lot of energy. It operates at constant volume.
Different condition.
Right, because volume is constant, no pressure volume work is done. So the heat measured in a bomb calorimeter corresponds directly to the change in internal energy, AAE. You calibrate it first with something like benzoic acid, where the combustion energy is precisely known.
Fascinating. And you mentioned our bodies.
Yeah.
How does calorimetry connect there?
Well, our body is an amazing thermodynamic machine. We metabolize food. Glucose breakdown is highly exothermic, releasing energy. Some of that EE becomes work, like moving muscles, thinking. The rest is released as heat, Q, keeping us warm.
And we regulate temperature.
Critically. When we overheat, we sweat. Evaporation is endothermic. It absorbs heat from our skin, cooling us down. That's why losing water and electrolytes during exercise is serious. It disrupts this cooling mechanism. It's all applied thermochemistry.
Wow. Okay, you mentioned enthalpy H earlier. Why do we need another energy term besides internal energy, E?
Great question. Enthalpy is defined as H equals E plus PV, internal energy plus pressure times volume. It turns out that for processes happening at constant pressure, which is very common, like reactions open to the atmosphere, the change in enthalpy H is exactly equal to the heat flow, QP.
So E equals UP.
Yes. It bundles up the internal energy change and any work done by expansion or contraction against the constant pressure. It just makes the accounting easier for common lab conditions. It's also a state function, just like E.
Okay, so EGH is often more practical than E for everyday chemistry, like that thermite reaction again. The massive heat release is E.
Under constant pressure, yes. It represents the change in the system's stored chemical potential energy being converted mostly into heat transferred to the surroundings.
And we talk about the enthalpy of reaction, Exentchankel. That's just products minus reactants.
H products minus reactants. A negative X exothermic means exothermic, positive means endothermic.
Got it. And there are rules for using these X values.
Yeah, 3 key things. 1, exergy is proportional to the amount. Burn, twice the methane, get twice the heat. Makes sense, right?
Yep, extensive property.
2, reversing a reaction reverses the sign of X. If AB is exothermic, then BA is endothermic plus H by the same amount.
Energy conservation again.
And 3, X depends on the physical state. Making liquid water releases more heat than making gaseous water because condensing the gas releases extra heat. So you must specify states, G, L, S, A, Q.
Okay, that makes sense. States matter. Now, Hess's law, you mentioned it earlier. How does that work?
Hess's law is super useful because enthalpy is a state function. The path doesn't matter. So if you can express a target reaction as a sum of other reactions whose X values you do know, you can just add or subtract those known H values to find the H for your target reaction.
So you can calculate EH for reactions that are hard to measure directly.
Exactly. Like finding the enthalpy of formation for carbon monoxide from carbon. You can't easily burn carbon to just get CO, but you know AH for burning C to CO2 and for burning CO to CO2. Hess's law lets you combine those to find AH for C to SCO.
Clever. And that ties into standard enthalpies of formation, AH degrees.
Perfectly. AHF degrees is the enthalpy change when 1 mole of a compound is formed from its constituent elements in their standard states.
Standard states,
Yeah.
pure element, 100 kPa pressure, usually 25 degrees C.
That's right. And crucially, the AH degrees of any element in its standard state, like solid carbon as graphite or O2 gas, is defined as 0. It doesn't need to be formed.
Okay, 0 for elements. How are these HFG values used then?
They are incredibly powerful because they're tabulated for thousands of compounds. You can calculate the standard enthalpy change for almost any reaction using a simple formula. AH degrees RSN equals the sum of the AHF degree values of the products, each multiplied by its coefficient in the balanced equation, minus the sum of the AHF degree values of the reactants, each multiplied by its coefficient. AHF degrees reactants, react.
Wow, okay, so with a table of HF degrees values, you can predict the energy change for countless reactions.
It's a cornerstone of chemical thermodynamics, hugely practical.
All right. Is there another way to estimate reaction energies? Bond enthalpies.
Yes, another approach. This views reactions simply as breaking old bonds and forming new ones. We know breaking bonds always requires energy input, positive enthalpy change,
Endothermic to break.
and forming bonds always releases energy, negative enthalpy change, exothermic to form.
Okay, so bond enthalpy is the energy needed to break 1 mole of a specific type of bond in the gas phase.
Yes, that gas phase part is important. Bond enthalpies are usually given as average values because the strength of, say, a CH bond can vary slightly depending on the molecule.
Average value, so it's an estimation.
It is an estimation, particularly because it works best for gas phase reactions. It doesn't account well for the extra energy involved with intermolecular forces in liquids and solids.
Got it. But for gases, the estimate is energy required to break bonds minus energy released forming bonds.
You got it. Ericsson, bond enthalpies of bonds broken, bond enthalpies of bonds formed, sum of energy in minus sum of energy out.
Okay, estimation, but still useful. Let's zoom out now. Foods and fuels. How does thermochemistry apply here? Fuel value.
Fuel value is just the energy released when 1 gram of a substance is completely burned, usually measured in kJ.
And for foods, carbs, fats, proteins.
They all have different fuel values. Carbohydrates like glucose give about 17 kJ, quick energy.
Okay.
Fats, like triglycerides, pack a much bigger punch, around 38 kilojoules. They're more reduced, meaning they have more CH bonds relative to CO bonds, so more energy is released when they're fully oxidized to CO2 and water. Plus, being nonpolar, they're great for long-term storage.
More bang for your buck, energetically speaking. And proteins.
Similar energy to carbs, about 17 kilojoules, but their main job is building tissues. Our body generally prefers carbs and fats for fuel, the nutrition labels on food. Those kilojoules or calories directly reflect these fuel values.
Right, those labels make more sense now. What about fuels for, the world, fossil fuel?
The big three: coal, petroleum, oil, and natural gas. Formed over geologic time, so they're non-renewable. They're mostly hydrocarbons, rich in carbon and hydrogen, hence their high fuel values.
But they have downsides.
Definitely. Natural gas, mostly methane, CH4, burns cleanest, producing mainly CO2 and water. Petroleum is more complex, needs refining. Coal, well, it's abundant, but often contains sulfur, leading to SO2 emissions and acid rain. And all fossil fuels release CO2, the primary greenhouse gas driving climate change.
That's the huge challenge, isn't it? Balancing energy needs with environmental impact.
It's arguably the central challenge of the 21st century, which pushes us towards alternatives.
Like nuclear.
Nuclear power is non-renewable in terms of fuel, but doesn't emit CO2 during operation. The issue there is managing radioactive wastes safely.
And renewables.
Solar, wind, geothermal, hydroelectric, biomass. These are inexhaustible on human timescales.
Solar seems so promising. Huge amounts of energy hit the Earth.
Immense amounts. But it's dilute, spread out, and intermittent. You don't get solar power at night or on cloudy days. So storage is key.
How can chemistry help with solar storage?
One exciting idea is using solar heat to drive endothermic reactions, like reacting methane and water to make CO and H2 synthesis gas. This stores solar energy in chemical bonds. Later, you can react the CO and H2 back together exothermically to release the heat when you need it, like a chemical battery for heat.
Clever. And that brings us to biofuels too, right? Chemistry put to work.
Exactly. Biofuels are derived from contemporary biomass, not ancient fossil deposits. Bioethanol is common, made by fermenting sugars, often from corn or sugarcane.
The food versus fuel issue comes up with corn, though.
Yes. Using corn for fuel competes with its use as food or animal feed, and the energy return isn't always great. Sugarcane is generally more efficient. A potentially better route is cellulosic ethanol, using non-food parts like stalks or wood chips.
More sustainable, maybe. What about biodiesel?
That's typically made from vegetable oils or animal fats. Reacting them chemically converts them into fuels similar to diesel. Again, questions arise about land use and competition with food.
It's complex, but ultimately, all this biomass energy traces back to.
Photosynthesis, the amazing natural process where plants use solar energy to convert CO2 and water into energy-rich carbohydrates like glucose, releasing the oxygen we breathe. It's the fundamental solar energy capture on Earth.
So we've covered a lot, from the tiny attractions between atoms defining bond energy,
To the first law governing all energy changer.
measuring heat flow with calorimeters,
Using state functions like enthalpy and Hess's law to predict reaction energies.
and finally, seeing how all this applies to the fuels that power our society and the food that powers our bodies, it really shows how central thermochemistry is.
It truly underpins so much, from molecular interactions to global energy policy. Understanding these energy transformations described in texts like chemistry, the central science is crucial.
Absolutely. It shapes how we think about everything from cooking dinner to tackling climate change.
And looking forward, the big question remains, how do we meet the growing global energy demand sustainably? Our population is increasing, developing nations are modernizing. It demands continuous innovation in energy sources and efficiency. Finding that balance between production and environmental stewardship, well, that's an ongoing challenge where chemistry plays a vital role. There's always more to discover, more to optimize.
A perfect thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.